I placed the divorce papers on the desk the exact moment Mafia boss Luciano Blackwood walked through the door, right when the lipstick stain from his mistress was still fresh on his collar. He froze. He stared at me. Then at the divorce papers. Then at my pregnant belly, and suddenly he went silent in a way that told me he was actually terrified. "Who told you?" his voice cracked. I didn't answer. I simply pushed the pen toward him. Luciano stepped back, a reflex from a man who had shot people without blinking, yet now wouldn't even touch the pen his wife handed him. Marina texted him. The screen lit up. "Are you coming, Luciano?" He snatched the phone like it burned him. "Evelyn, I can explain." I cut him off with one simple sentence. "You went to her." I went to the lawyer. His expression changed instantly. Not because I wanted a divorce, but because he had just realized there was something else inside that folder. Something he never believed I would dare to touch. An ownership certificate for half of his empire. And then came the truth he never expected. I am Evelyn Hart, the legal wife of the Mafia boss, and the only person alive who can sign and take half his kingdom away. That night, everything that had been true about my life for the past 3 years shattered, and the sound it made wasn't a crash, but just a quiet, sickening thud, like something heavy hitting deep sand, and I stood there in the center of that ridiculously oversized living room, feeling the sheer weight of what I'd just done, watching Luciano's face fall into a mask of total shock that I honestly thought only I felt anymore, because he had spent so long assuming I was just decorative, a quiet little wife from a simple background who only existed to make his life look respectable and predictable. And it was in that second, with the grand silent house pressing in around us, the imported Persian rug feeling impossibly soft under my feet, that I felt a dizzying mix of fear and freedom, the kind you get when you finally cut a rope that was holding you captive, knowing you're going to fall, but trusting that the fall is better than the climb. A leap of faith executed with a calculator and a lawyer's signature, and I didn't cry not a single tear, because I knew if I let one drop, he would have grabbed onto it, used it as a lever to pry my resolve open and crawl back into my life with empty promises and diamond necklaces, and that simply wasn't an option anymore. Not with this new life kicking softly inside me, demanding a future cleaner than the lies and the filth he'd brought home on his perfectly tailored suit. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the clean, dry air of the house fill my lungs, focusing on the cool marble beneath my bare feet, grounding myself in the physical reality of the moment, because the emotional reality was too much to face all at once. And I watched his eyes narrow, the shock quickly morphing into that cold, calculating glare I knew meant he was already running algorithms in his head, figuring out the odds, calculating the angles, scrambling to find the flaw in my paperwork. And I knew that the real fight was just beginning, that this was only the opening skirmish. But the important thing was that I had landed the first completely unexpected blow, and he hadn't even seen it coming. He always controlled the narrative, controlled the tempo, always had the final word. But tonight I owned the silence and the way his jaw ticked, the way his shoulders, which were usually so impossibly broad and solid, now looked slightly hunched under the weight of his sudden vulnerability, told me I had finally broken through the impenetrable armor of his self-regard. The ownership certificate wasn't just paper. It represented the legal means to dismantle his legitimate holding corporation, the one he used to interface with the respectable world, the foundation of his wealth in real estate and renewable energy. And he realized the implications instantly. It meant not just divorce, but professional ruin, the loss of the clean foundation that propped up the dirty business, a consequence far graver than mere infidelity, a threat to his very survival as a legitimate businessman. I reached for the small, worn leather bag I'd placed on a side table, pulling the strap over my shoulder. A final deliberate movement that signaled I was done, not just with the conversation, but with the entire pretense of our life together. A life that had always been about his power and my silence. A trade-off I had finally decided was too expensive, too toxic to inflict on the child I was carrying, the physical manifestation of my refusal to be invisible anymore. He took a hesitant step toward me, reaching out a hand, his fingers twitching slightly, but I shifted my weight just a fraction, a tiny, almost invisible movement that carried the weight of 1,000 miles, and he stopped immediately, his hand hanging uselessly in the air between us, a gesture of control thwarted by the simplest act of withdrawal, and that more than the divorce papers, more than the financial document, was the moment he truly understood I was gone. That the meek, easily managed wife he thought he possessed had simply dissolved into something entirely different, something he couldn't touch or command. The very air in the room felt thick with his suppressed rage, the kind of terrible, quiet fury that usually preceded an execution. But I stood there and simply waited, meeting his gaze not with defiance, but with a steady, empty calm that unnerved him more than any screaming match ever could have, because my quietness had always been my greatest vulnerability to him. But now it was my shield and my sword, the weapon forged from his own neglect. Now, before I tell you what happened next, because it gets really complicated and frankly a little scary, I just need a quick second to reset if you don't mind. This whole thing. It's not easy to talk about even now because you're sharing things you thought you'd buried deep down, but you guys have always been so supportive of me. And honestly, that connection, that community, it makes a huge difference when you're facing something this overwhelming, something that makes you feel so completely alone in a world that's decided to just walk all over you. So if you're listening right now, if this story is touching something inside of you, please just take a second to open up your phone, hit that like button for me, and maybe drop a comment below and let me know you're here, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, because honestly, knowing I have you all walking through this with me is the only thing that gave me the strength to keep going when everything felt like it was falling apart, and I really wouldn't have made it through without that quiet, shared strength we have here, knowing we all understand what it's like to be underestimated. Thank you. Now let's get back to Luciano standing there looking like someone had just told him he'd lost his favorite limb, because that's exactly what I had done. I had amputated half of his empire, and he was realizing it was gone, and he couldn't feel anything but the phantom pain of loss, a pain that was certainly deeper than any brief heartbreak over a lost marriage, the kind of shock that rearranges a man's understanding of reality, forcing him to confront the fact that his deepest beliefs about his power were simply wrong, realizing that the only thing worse than being betrayed was being betrayed by the one person you discounted entirely, the one who saw all your secrets while you only saw her surface, the one he had spent 3 years thinking was too naive to understand a simple balance sheet. So he didn't sign the papers, of course. He just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to re-establish control over a situation that had clearly run away from him, his mind racing to recall which specific document granted me the leverage I now held, checking off every legal safety net he had thought he installed, and he let the pen drop onto the mahogany desk, the click echoing in the massive room, the sound sharp and final. And he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. Now that familiar, almost soothing tone he used right before things got truly ugly, asking me who I thought I was, where I got the papers, and who had the audacity to prepare them for me because he had all the best lawyers. Didn't I know that his team was untouchable, specializing in jurisdictional loopholes and preemptive strikes that made his assets invisible even to the government, and for a quiet girl like me who came from nothing and knew nobody important? Finding someone capable of this kind of legal maneuver was supposed to be impossible, utterly beyond my reach, because this wasn't just a divorce filing. This was financial surgery performed by a master craftsman, someone who knew how to operate in the grayest areas of international finance, targeting the non-extraditable holdings. But I just watched him, my hands steady on the strap of my bag, and I didn't give him any information, not a single name, not a single clue, because I'd learned long ago that with Luciano, silence was the loudest, most effective weapon you could wield, the one that ate away at his absolute certainty, his God complex. And the fact that he had to ask, that he genuinely didn't know, was already winning for me. He started pacing, running his hand through his perfectly slicked back hair, a nervous gesture he usually hid from everyone, but he wasn't hiding it from me. Not tonight, because his mask had totally failed, and he pulled out his own phone, not the one Marina texted, but his burner, and started barking orders into it. His voice low but sharp enough to slice glass, telling someone to pull every surveillance record check, every bank transaction, every visitor log for the last 3 months, demanding to know how I'd gotten the authority, the documents, the access codes, because he couldn't wrap his head around the fact that the woman he dismissed as a simple ornament, a delicate flower easily crushed, was actually the one holding the hammer ready to dismantle the very foundation of his life. And I just watched him scramble, realizing that the shock wasn't that I was leaving, but that I had orchestrated the entire exit with the ruthlessness and precision he thought only he possessed. A mirror image of his own cunning, and for a fleeting second I almost felt sorry for the look of genuine bewilderment in his eyes. But then I remembered the scent of cheap perfume that always clung to his suits, and the quiet dignity of my father who was dead because of men like him, and the pity evaporated, leaving behind only the cold, clear focus I needed to walk out that door and never look back at the life of luxury and lies he'd trapped me in. His panic was becoming almost pathetic. He was throwing out names of lawyers, threats of lawsuits, demanding to know if I'd spoken to the firm in Geneva or the one in Cayman, listing off his untouchable network, and the fact that none of those names were relevant, that my counsel was an independent genius. He'd never even heard of a legal ghost specializing in non-extradition transfers of marital assets. Only deepened his frustration, like he was swinging wildly in the dark at a target he couldn't see, making the victory feel even cleaner for me, because he was wasting precious time attacking phantoms. While I was already halfway out the door, the legal mechanism of his downfall already moving with unstoppable momentum. The only thing I offered him was a quiet, direct look that confirmed his worst suspicion. I knew everything, and I had acted on it with a speed he never thought possible, from someone he considered intellectually beneath him, sealing the fate of the Blackwood Empire with the same pen he used to sign dinner checks. And I simply turned my back, then leaving him standing there in the middle of his ruined palace. The sound of my slow, steady footsteps on the marble, signaling the end of his unquestioned reign, the only sound more deafening than his eventual terrible silence. The next few days were chaos, but I was gone, sleeping in a quiet, anonymous hotel room, miles away, a place so bland and ordinary, it was invisible, located intentionally outside of his usual surveillance grid, chosen for its proximity to an international law library, and the silence there was incredible. A physical weight lifted from my shoulders, the first true peace I'd known since marrying him. While Luciano, I heard from my legal team, was tearing the city apart, trying to find the cracks in his fortress, throwing every resource he had at the problem, because he just couldn't accept the impossible that I had an entire legal strategy, a security network, and a financial escape plan laid out months in advance. And the truth of it, when he finally uncovered it, must have been a punch to the gut. A deep, sickening realization of his own fatal arrogance, because I had gone straight for the jugular. I hadn't just gotten a lawyer. I had secured one of the best. A man who specialized in untangling and tracing the black threads in legitimate multinational finances. The kind of genius who knew how to separate the clean money from the dirty. The kind of specialist Luciano's own people would only ever use for defense, never for attack. And this man, this legal ghost, had been working for me quietly, sifting through the tangled web of offshore accounts and shell companies that Luciano had so foolishly given me, signing authority overconvinced I was too ignorant to ever use it, never bothering to check the fine print of my inheritance, or the decades of financial mastery I had quietly absorbed from my late father, knowledge gleaned from listening to his phone calls since I was a child, learning the language of money as a lullaby. What my legal counsel found and secured was every document, every email, every receipt, every plane ticket, every hotel booking, proving his affair with Marina over the past 2 months, turning what he thought was a private indiscretion into a documented case of marital and corporate negligence that could cripple him legally and politically within his own world, proving a pattern of dereliction of duty that would make the council question his fitness to rule, making him look sloppy and emotionally compromised, unfit for the seriousness of his position. I had taken the clean side of the empire, the legitimate real estate, the seemingly innocent tech investments, the lucrative philanthropic foundation that served as his public face, all of it, every asset that allowed him to project an image of respectability, including a priceless collection of Renaissance art, stored in a Swiss vault, and the famous family vineyard in Tuscany, and quietly legally transferred the signing authority into a trust. I controlled a trust that was now physically located somewhere he couldn't touch, without triggering an international investigation across several jurisdictions, which was exactly the kind of transparent, messy inquiry Luciano couldn't afford, because exposure was death in his world, and I had forced him to choose between losing his legitimate face or suffering the legal consequences of his illicit activities, effectively making his most powerful tool, legitimacy, my own personal weapon. The greatest insult of all was the security detail I hadn't just hired some random bodyguards. I had managed to secure a detail from Cassius Ward's firm, Luciano's most bitter and dangerous rival, a move that was less about physical safety and more about sending an absolutely unmistakable message of total war to Luciano and the entire Blackwood organization, a public declaration that I was now operating under the protection of his enemy, a move that implied I had sold every one of his secrets to the competition and was actively coordinating a downfall, even though I hadn't simply by leveraging the political dynamics of their rivalry. I wasn't just leaving, I was aligning with the opposition, and the entire thing was orchestrated every single detail because I was the daughter of the murdered Mafia financier, the one Luciano thought he'd bought silence from with marriage. And I hadn't been weak. I had simply been gathering strength, watching and waiting for the exact right moment to take back everything he'd stolen from me years ago. He thought he was marrying the orphan of a former associate, but he was actually marrying a ticking time bomb of financial knowledge and inherited authority that dated back decades, a lineage that held more power in the underworld's financial backbone than any bullet ever could. And the realization that I was executing the exact kind of strategic long-game planning he prided himself on must have been devastating, because he was undone by his own overconfidence, convinced that low-status people like me simply didn't possess the necessary intellect or patience for true large-scale revenge, a mistake he would now pay for with half of his kingdom and his reputation watching his empire crumble. Not by violence, but by paperwork signed by a woman he underestimated. You can imagine what happened next. The news exploded, and I mean exploded not just on some gossip site, but in the actual legitimate high-stakes circles where Luciano lived and breathed, because the combination of a high-profile pregnant wife filing for divorce and crippling the financial backbone of an empire overnight was too sensational, too juicy to be contained, and the headlines were brutal. Something like, Blackwood's pregnant wife files for divorce, after catching him with Mistress Empire in jeopardy, dominating the news cycle for days, and causing his legitimate stocks to plummet across multiple exchanges, triggering a domino effect of panic among his associates. And the fallout was immediate and humiliating for Luciano, reverberating through every boardroom and back alley where his power resided, because the Mafia Council, those old, self-righteous monsters who judged worth not by honor but by control, and the appearance of domestic stability, they were mercilessly mocking him, the whispers spreading like wildfire that he had lost his wife, that he lacked the fundamental control required of a boss, and if he couldn't even control the woman he slept next to, the mother of his unborn child, then he was weak. And the next thing he'd lose would surely be his entire empire, which was exactly what I needed them to believe to buy myself more time and protection. They weren't even hiding their contempt. During a supposedly secret meeting of the 5 families, one of the older men, a gross, greasy man named Salvatore, who had always been jealous of Luciano's youth, made a loud, theatrical sigh and asked Luciano if he had checked under his sofa cushions for the rest of his portfolio, a line that was repeated and chuckled over across the entire floor, showing how quickly his fear had eroded into ridicule. And another old man, Niccolo, simply shook his head slowly and stated loud enough for everyone to hear that a man who trusts a quiet woman with his signature deserves everything he gets, noting that I, the quiet one, was the real power player he should have feared. They pointed to the fact that his affair, his weakness, had been the catalyst proving that he prioritized pleasure over responsibility, a grave sin in their rigid code, a sign of moral decay that they feared would infect their own ranks, and his credibility suffered massive, irreversible damage because of his poor judgment in the woman he chose to betray. Even his own men, the ones who had sworn absolute loyalty, were muttering among themselves, saying the boss had let emotions get him, which in their cold, calculating world was the ultimate sign of failure, a vulnerability that could and would be exploited, and they started hedging their bets quietly, moving their own assets, and reducing their exposure to the Blackwood name, anticipating the inevitable collapse, and looking for the first opportunity to jump ship, seeing their chance to carve up the suddenly vulnerable empire. And the Mistress Marina, she was the cruelest of all, not because she was heartbroken, but because she was shallow, a power climber, who quickly realized she'd hitched her wagon to a suddenly collapsing star, sneering openly in public to anyone who would listen, asking how Luciano the Great Blackwood couldn't even keep one fragile woman loyal, completely unaware of the irony that she was Cassius Ward's puppet, a piece of temporary bait in a game she didn't even know she was playing, openly boasting that she was simply too much woman for him to handle, claiming that his focus on controlling her had cost him his actual power, a narrative that stung him deeply because it played right into the narrative of him being distracted by base desires and ultimately incompetent. Every rival, every man who'd ever been beaten down by Luciano's arrogance, they were all laughing in his face during their weekly meetings, the kind of laughter that wasn't loud but deep and contemptuous. And Luciano, the man who thrived on being feared and untouchable, saw his entire reputation, his absolute control, utterly crash and burn, all because of the quiet woman he'd kept in the gilded cage, the one who'd learned his lessons better than he ever gave her credit for, and the knowledge of his humiliation. The very real palpable shame I knew he was enduring was the only thing that allowed me to finally sleep through the night, a silent moral victory against a man who thought morality was for the weak, a kind of justice that didn't require me to get my hands dirty only to be smarter, leaving him to choke on the consequences of his own hubris. The damage was total, spreading beyond his finances to the very credibility of his name, proving that a quiet woman with a pen could be far more destructive than 1,000 armed men, an unprecedented event in the history of the families that would be cited for decades as the Blackwood blunder, marking a profound shift in power dynamics within the city. It was during this period of intentional isolation, while Luciano was still reeling and trying to stem the bleeding, that Cassius Ward made his move. And it was calculated, subtle, and utterly disarming in a way Luciano never could have managed. Because Cassius approached me himself, not through a lawyer or a firm, but in person, in the lobby of the anonymous hotel I thought was secure, tracking me down. Not through force, but through quiet networked knowledge, knowing exactly which shell corporation owned the hotel, and therefore where I was hiding, and he didn't swagger or threaten. He just sat down across from me with a quiet, genuine seriousness, his movements slow and deliberate, sitting perfectly straight, with a deceptive air of vulnerability, adopting the posture of a sincere, concerned friend. And he looked nothing like the monster I'd been told to fear, instead offering a measured, empathetic understanding that I hadn't realized I was starved for. And the sheer emptiness of being married to Luciano, the constant emotional drought, the silence that tasted like ash, made Cassius's slight, focused attention feel like an entire oasis, which was exactly the psychological trick he was playing, because he looked me right in the eye, and the first thing he said was, "You want freedom, Evelyn. The kind that's quiet, clean, and irreversible, I can give it." And I just stared at him, trying to reconcile the cold-blooded rival boss with the man who was sitting there with such an almost gentle intensity, a man who spoke to me as an equal, not a possession, confirming the narrative I was already telling myself about him. And then he delivered the line that hit me with the force of a wrecking ball, the psychological bomb that was precisely targeted at my deepest, oldest wound. He said that the long-standing rumor, the one I'd been told by Luciano, the one that claimed Luciano himself had killed my father, a rumor that had haunted my entire marriage, fueling my quiet bitterness, and my slow-burn revenge plot, might not be true. And he didn't offer proof, just a sliver of doubt, a question mark placed exactly where it would do the most psychological damage, right in the foundation of my deeply held belief system, suggesting that I had sacrificed my happiness and my peace for a lie perpetuated by the man I was trying to destroy, that my entire grand plan for justice was misdirected, twisting the knife of moral uncertainty. He watched my face, carefully noting the flicker of hope and confusion, noting exactly how much that single lie had defined my relationship with his rival, understanding that if my motivation was flawed, my entire escape plan would feel hollow. And then he leaned forward, his gaze dropping momentarily to my heavily pregnant belly, and his voice softened further, almost into a whisper, but one that carried absolute conviction, telling me that whatever I was doing, whatever path I chose, my child deserved a life without blood, without the constant stain and the shadow of the underworld that defined men like Luciano, and potentially even himself. And he added that the next generation shouldn't have to pay for the sins of the fathers, a statement that was both profound and utterly hypocritical, designed to make me see him not as an enemy, but as a protective co-parent figure, even though, He was neither using the purity of my unborn child as the ultimate appeal, and it was that last comment, that acknowledgement of the life I was carrying, that utterly cracked my resolve, making me question every single part of my marriage, every belief I held about who was the villain and who was the savior. Because Luciano had always used the child as leverage, a symbol of control, while Cassius used the child as a reason for hope and escape, as a symbol of a possible clean future. And I walked away from that meeting with a churning doubt that was exactly what Cassius wanted, exactly what he needed to pull me completely to his side, unaware that I was being systematically and expertly manipulated by a master of psychological warfare who knew exactly where to place the poison, using my grief and my quiet strength as tools against me, turning my greatest emotional drive into my ultimate vulnerability, replacing my hatred for Luciano with a terrifying ambiguity, an ethical gray area that was far more destabilizing, forcing me to shift my focus from revenge to mere survival in a game I was only just beginning to truly see. I started digging, not because I trusted Cassius, because I didn't trust anyone in this world, but because the doubt he planted was a poison. I couldn't ignore a tiny seed of possibility that maybe Luciano wasn't the monster who killed my father. And the possibility, no matter how faint, was enough to make me hesitate for the first time since I walked out the door. The foundation of my vengeance suddenly trembling, and Luciano, while he was still desperately trying to keep his financial empire from imploding, was doing some of his own digging, not into me, which he already considered a lost cause, but into Cassius, trying to figure out how his rival managed to secure my protection, why I didn't fear Cassius the way I had learned to fear him, and what he uncovered must have been yet another series of sickening blows to his ego and his heart. A deep dive into historical records and surveillance that revealed a narrative far more intimate and painful than he could have imagined, involving old land deeds and school records. He never bothered to check documents he had ignored in his original background check of me, deeming them irrelevant to my financial worth. The reports started piling up, showing that Cassius hadn't just met with me after the divorce filing, but that he had been systematically inserting himself into my periphery for months, before I made the move, always in the background, a chance encounter at a coffee shop, where I only remembered the quality of the latte, a mysterious favor granted to one of the charities I supported. Small, insignificant moments that were, in retrospect, carefully orchestrated touches, proving his obsessive, years-long interest in my life. An interest that felt less controlling than Luciano's, but far more deeply rooted, far more dangerous and insidious patience that Luciano, with his quick temper and immediate need for gratification, could never possess the kind of obsessive focus that only comes from decades of planning. The worst part, the part that probably drove Luciano completely insane, was the realization that Cassius was my childhood friend, the boy I used to build sandcastles with on the rare vacations my father allowed, the boy who used to sneak me candy behind my father's back, a memory that had been violently erased from my mind right after my father's death, when the trauma caused a genuine and profound psychological block, leaving a decade-long hole in my personal history that I couldn't access a protective mechanism that had kept the worst pain at bay. And Cassius had been keeping that truth, those old photographs of us laughing together for all these years, proving he hadn't just known me. He had loved me silently, patiently, long before Luciano ever even entered the picture. Long before he had reduced me to a position on his arm and a signature on his documents, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim his childhood friend, the knowledge of which must have felt like a cruel cosmic joke to Luciano. Luciano must have looked at those photos, at the image of the young Evelyn, who was carefree and completely unafraid, her smile wide and genuine, and realized he never truly possessed that version of me, never even came close to knowing her. Only the guarded, silent shell that remained after my father died, the woman shaped by grief, not joy, and that realization was a deeper form of loss than any money could represent, the loss of a soul he never knew existed. The final crushing realization for Luciano, the deepest wound of all, wasn't the loss of money or status, but the gut-wrenching, humiliating knowledge that I, Evelyn, had never, not once, feared Cassius Ward, the most notoriously violent man in the city, the way I feared my own husband, the man who was supposed to be my protector. Because while Luciano's power always came wrapped in a terrifying threat of control and harm, the kind that made me constantly guard my words and my actions, afraid of triggering his volatile temper, Cassius's power, even at its most dangerous, was always veiled in a strange, compelling layer of respect and distance. A dark kind of dignity that made me feel seen, not owned, a stark contrast that Luciano could no longer ignore, knowing that the thing he envied most was the quiet, genuine connection he'd destroyed by choosing to be a monster, by choosing power over my trust every single day of our marriage. Realizing too late that I ran toward the one who respected my boundaries, even if he was his enemy, a fatal blind spot in his own emotional defense system, the consequence of which was the dismantling of his life. But I wasn't waiting for either of them to sort out their feelings or their rivalries. I was the one in motion now, and I wasn't just running. I was attacking, moving with the same kind of cold, methodical precision that had earned Luciano his fortune, because I had seen the opportunity, the weakness created by his emotional panic, and the public humiliation. And I decided that the best defense was a massive, overwhelming offense, so I gave the nod to my lawyer, and the filings hit the court docket in a rapid, unforgiving succession that left Luciano absolutely no room to breathe or maneuver, starting with the immediate aggressive filing for asset division, demanding a clear, untangled split of every single cent, every piece of property, every stock and bond that was currently within the legal jurisdiction of the state, ensuring that the process wouldn't be a drawn-out negotiation, but a clean, sharp break that would force him to expose his entire network to legal scrutiny, forcing the sale of certain properties he cherished just to meet the immediate liquidity demands, including the massive vineyard in Tuscany he considered his personal sanctuary, as well as several priceless unregistered art collections he kept hidden from the tax authorities, along with the corporate jet he used for all his illicit meetings, forcing all his secret affairs into the open under the guise of equitable distribution. The sheer audacity of the claim was meant to paralyze him, forcing him to dedicate resources to legal defense rather than counterattack. The most devastating blow, the one that everyone talked about, was the request for a mandatory paternity test, a move that wasn't born out of doubt, but out of absolute necessity, to prevent Luciano from using the baby as leverage, to deny him the claim to an heir that he would inevitably weaponize, stripping him of the one piece of property he actually cared about, rendering the future of the Blackwood dynasty uncertain, and public knowledge a calculated risk that humiliated him further, forcing his vulnerability onto the front pages, and making the council question the very lineage of his successor, implying even his future was illegitimate, forcing him to defend the legitimacy of his own blood in a court of law. And I didn't stop there. I immediately formed my own dedicated security detail separate from Cassius's firm, because I knew I couldn't truly trust anyone in this world, not even the man who claimed to be my childhood friend, securing my own independent perimeter of safety, staffed by veterans I personally vetted, mostly ex-military, who cared only about the contract, and had no ties to the local underworld, making me a neutral, self-governing power in the middle of their war. A force that answered to no one but my lawyer and the growing life inside me, ensuring my safety wasn't dependent on the whims of a rival boss or a betrayed husband. And I took all my belongings, the few things that actually mattered, a small box of old letters, a photograph of my mother, and the clothes on my back, and moved out of the anonymous hotel into a quiet, heavily secured apartment, high up in a building in a completely different sector of the city, chosen specifically for its robust security and distance from all their usual territories, a place that felt like mine for the first time in years, a tiny, safe harbor in the storm, sparsely furnished, but clean, the stark walls a welcome relief from the oppressive gold and marble of Luciano's mansion. The rumors immediately began to spread faster and more dangerously than before, the whispers turning into outright pronouncements that Evelyn Hart is officially under Cassius Ward's protection, a public narrative that I allowed to take root, knowing it would confuse and enrage Luciano more than any truth I could speak, tying his hands legally and politically, and the combination of my surgical legal assault and the calculated political alignment with his rival sent Luciano completely over the edge, proving to everyone in the underworld that the powerful, calculating boss had finally completely and irrevocably lost control, replaced by a desperate, wounded man, scrambling to reclaim what he'd once foolishly deemed insignificant, watching as the quiet woman he married systematically dismantled his entire world, leaving him standing amidst the wreckage of his own pride. Incapable of responding with his usual violence because I had encased myself in a legal and political shield he could not pierce without destroying himself. He finally snapped, and I knew it was coming, because the phone calls became less about threats and more about begging, about trying to logically explain away months of betrayal, about promising new houses and clean money, offering me back the parts of the empire I had already legally secured, desperately attempting to negotiate a surrender that I had no intention of accepting, his voice occasionally cracking with a pathetic vulnerability. I never thought he possessed the sound of his desperation grating in the sterile silence of my new place. And then inevitably came the confrontation, the one I knew I couldn't avoid forever, the moment he showed up at the address of my new apartment, having undoubtedly paid off half the city to track me down, bypassing my newly installed security measures, with the terrifying ease of a man who wrote the rulebook for breaking and entering, a dark reminder that despite his flaws, his power was real, and I let him in, standing calmly by the door as he burst in, looking disheveled and wild-eyed, completely unlike the perfectly controlled man I had married, his expensive suit. Rumpled his tie, loosened a desperation in his eyes that was both terrifying and pitiful, the mark of a powerful predator cornered and confused, and the contrast between his desperation and the quiet domestic calm of my new place was jarring, a visual representation of how far the mighty had fallen. And then his eyes landed on the kitchen and he froze because there was Cassius, of all people, standing casually by the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Something simple and comforting, the steam rising gently in the quiet air. And the sight of his rival in what should have been his own domestic space was a violation of every sacred rule in his life, hitting him harder than any bullet ever could, turning the air electric with instant murderous tension, Luciano's fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, his shoulders tense with the terrible effort of restraint. The scent of simmering vegetables and herbs filled the air, replacing the usual heavy odor of cologne and leather that followed Luciano. And the sheer normalcy of the scene was an unbearable insult to him, a deliberate, crushing reminder of the simple, peaceful life he had failed to provide, and Cassius had effortlessly mimicked. The sight of me standing next to Cassius, leaning just slightly on his shoulder, a small, unconscious gesture of comfort and intimacy that I hadn't even realized I was making, until I saw Luciano's face, must have felt like a physical assault to him, because it wasn't a passionate embrace. It was something worse, something soft and genuine, the quiet familiarity of two people who were simply comfortable in each other's presence. The easy trust that was a foreign concept to Luciano and Cassius without acknowledging Luciano's presence at all, just continued to stir the soup. His expression placid, almost bored, which only intensified Luciano's rage, showing that he viewed Luciano not as a threat, but as an inconvenience. And I saw a bead of sweat tracing a line down my temple from the cooking heat. A physical discomfort that felt intense under the scrutiny, and Cassius, still ignoring the towering figure of my husband, reached out with a gentle cloth and wiped the sweat away, a small, tender action that was completely devoid of drama, but full of deep shared understanding. And in that second, something shifted inside me, the tension finally easing, and a genuine smile, a gentle small curve of my lips that Luciano hadn't seen in years, a smile I hadn't even known I possessed anymore, appeared directed only at Cassius for the soup, for the gentle cloth, for the quiet moment of peace he'd created. And then Cassius leaned down, placing a soft paternal kiss on my forehead, before turning back to the stove. A simple gesture of affection that sealed Luciano's fate, proving he was the better pretender, the superior manipulator of my deepest needs, and the raw, undisguised agony on Luciano's face, the look of a man who realized he had lost everything he ever valued, replaced by a searing, visceral pain that looked exactly like a knife. Sliding slowly into his chest was the last thing I ever wanted to see. The final, undeniable proof that the price of my silence had been his own soul, and the quiet dignity I held in that moment felt less like a victory, and more like a profound, terrible loss for both of us. The culmination of years of misunderstanding and misplaced loyalty finally laid bare in a quiet kitchen where a simple bowl of soup was the true declaration of war, signifying that his rival had not only taken his money, but his domestic life, his wife's trust, and her future, forcing him to confront the simple fact that his own actions had led to this agonizing public undoing. The storm that night was violent, one of those sudden theatrical tempests that rips through the city, shaking the apartment windows and making the lights flicker, the wind howling like a trapped beast, rattling the secured frames. And it was during the chaos of the thunder and the rain, with the air charged with electricity and fear, the perfect dramatic backdrop, that Cassius finally cracked the quiet composure he'd maintained for months, finally giving way under the pressure of the moment, the intensity of Luciano's looming presence, and the sheer weight of his own monstrous secret. And he started talking rapidly, nervously, his voice thin and high-pitched beneath the crashing thunder. Not to me, but almost to himself, his words spilling out like oil onto the floor, as if the storm had broken the dam that was holding his truth, captive, revealing everything with a terrifying, brutal clarity that left me breathless and utterly ruined, forcing me to grasp the true horror of his decade-long scheme. He admitted that Marina wasn't Luciano's mistress at all. She was his Cassius's, and she had been bait, a perfectly placed, perfectly timed distraction designed to trigger Luciano's predictable arrogance and my predictable reaction to push the marriage to the breaking point, so he could swoop in as the savior, the ultimate goal being to gain my legal authority through the ensuing chaos of the divorce, securing the assets I'd inherited from my father, consolidating the entire financial underworld under his sole control. And he boasted about how easy it was to manipulate Luciano's ego and my hatred, playing us both perfectly against each other, setting the stage for his final triumph. And the ultimate soul-crushing revelation was the truth about my father, the one that had been the foundation of my entire revenge plot, because Luciano hadn't killed him, hadn't even been in the country when it happened. The real murderer, the cold-blooded monster who orchestrated my father's death to steal the financial authority he knew I would eventually inherit, was Cassius Ward himself, the man standing next to me, the man who had just kissed my forehead and made me soup. And he detailed the murder with a chilling lack of remorse, explaining how he'd carefully framed Luciano to eliminate two problems with one stone. Luciano, a growing rival, and my father, the last man who stood in his way. A masterstroke of calculated cruelty that had defined my life for 10 years, detailing how he planted the false evidence and let the trauma erase my memory, ensuring I would never question the convenient narrative and his entire reason for approaching me. For the decade of patient waiting and the orchestrated seduction was never about love or freedom or my child. It was always and only about stealing my inherited financial authority, the authority that the naive, grieving wife had quietly secured under the guise of an amicable divorce. And Marina, the supposed victim of the affair, was a willing, eager co-conspirator, a pawn cooperating fully to destroy my marriage and hand me over to Cassius, completely destroying me emotionally, because I realized that Luciano hadn't hidden the truth of my father's death, because he was guilty, but because he knew the real killer was a creature far more terrifying, far more insidious than he was a ghost from my past, who knew my heart, who knew the hole in my memory, and he hid the truth to shield me, the quiet, unsuspecting woman, from the real monster that was Cassius, the man who had loved me in a twisted, possessive, dangerous way since we were children, choosing to take the bullet of my hatred rather than expose me to the greater danger, accepting my betrayal as a form of protection for me, a terrible, desperate act of dark love. And this realization of Luciano's dark, terrible love, the way he had chosen to endure my hatred and my revenge just to keep me safe from the truth, accepting my betrayal as a form of protection for me, hit me with a force that made me physically collapse my legs, giving out beneath me the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, and the terrifying realization that I had been a pawn in a game I didn't even understand. A game played by two monsters, one dark and honest in his monstrosity, the other smiling and insidious, leaving me completely and utterly destroyed, knowing I had willingly armed the man who killed my father and used my unborn child as a pawn in his grand manipulative strategy, realizing that my vengeance had played directly into the hands of the true killer, leaving me feeling like a complete fool, drowning in a wave of moral and emotional shock. Before I could even process the full scope of the collapse, before the sobs could even truly begin, before the raw grief of realizing my entire life had been predicated on a lie, could consume me. Cassius, his mask completely gone, now his face a terrifying blend of possessive mania and cold calculating triumph, moved with a sudden frightening speed, because he had what he wanted. He had my emotional and legal compliance. And now he needed the final piece, the ultimate leverage, and he brutally seized me, his hands grabbing my arm with bone-crushing force, the pain immediate and intense, throwing me into a waiting black van as the storm raged outside, the thunder mirroring the violent pounding in my own ears, the windows rattling violently with the force of the wind, and I was taken to some desolate, isolated warehouse near the docks, the kind of place that only existed for the terrible things that men like him did, in the dark, smelling of salt fish and decay. The air heavy with dust and the chill of the concrete floor, and I found myself strapped down to a cold metal operating table, the crude leather restraints digging painfully into my wrists and ankles, secured tightly by rusty buckles. The smell of old blood and oil thick in the air, and the horror of the situation hit me with a sickening wave of nausea, the sharp metallic smell of disinfectant and stale water filling the air, the single flickering overhead light, casting long unstable shadows, the chilling realization that this was not just a kidnapping for ransom. This was personal, deeply psychotically personal. His final act of possessive control over the woman. He couldn't simply have intending to make the child his bargaining chip with Luciano, or failing that his final cruel revenge against the Blackwood lineage. Cassius stood over me, his silhouette looming against the sickly yellow light, a monstrous figure of triumphant evil. And he leaned in close, his voice a low, chilling hiss that cut through the sound of the rain, lashing against the corrugated iron roof. And he delivered the final, terrifying threat. The one that broke me entirely, saying that if the baby I was carrying was Luciano Blackwood's blood, he would erase it, using the cold clinical language of a surgeon, describing an excision running his gloved hand over my swollen belly, making the threat terrifyingly physical, savoring the look of pure dread in my eyes, and the word erase echoed in the vast, empty space, a promise of absolute annihilation, a threat against the only truly pure thing I had left in this twisted world, and I couldn't hold back the sobs anymore. They racked my body, tearing through my chest, the grief and terror combining into a sound of utter despair, and I pleaded with him weakly, hopelessly, saying that Luciano wouldn't come for me, that I had taken his money and his pride, that he had already chosen his empire over me, a lie. I was telling myself just to prepare for the inevitable death that was surely coming, believing every word of it, trusting in the cold, transactional nature of the world I had always known, hoping to appeal to his ego by confirming Luciano's defeat. And Cassius simply threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, mocking, utterly deranged sound that resonated in the cavernous space, confirming my deepest fear that Luciano was gone, that I was alone, and that the only thing left for me was to shut my eyes, take a final shaky breath, and accept the gruesome end that this monster had so meticulously planned for me, and the innocent life I carried, a terrifying resignation that felt like the ultimate humiliation, the ultimate failure of my quiet strength to protect what I loved most, knowing I was doomed because I had trusted the man who looked like hope, waiting for the end to come quickly and cleanly. But then out of the chaos of the storm, out of the desolate silence of the warehouse came a sound that cut through the rain and the thunder, the sound of an engine roaring, a heavy familiar growl, followed by the screech of tires skidding on wet concrete right outside the main door, and then the deep familiar sound of a single powerful gunshot, a deliberate warning shot fired high into the rafters, meant to announce his presence and his intention, without wasting a bullet, echoing loudly in the enclosed space, and the sound of Luciano Blackwood's voice, a roar that was completely raw and unhinged, filling the entire warehouse, the echo bouncing off the cold, hard walls, demanding to know where I was. His voice, hoarse with urgency, and the sheer audacity of it. The reckless, insane bravery of one man storming a fortified position all by himself. His security detail nowhere in sight. Just him and his solitary gun hit me with an electric jolt of hope and terror. And I saw Luciano emerge from the shadows armed with nothing but a single gun. His suit soaked his face, streaked with rain and dirt. But his eyes locked solely on me, radiating a desperate, all-consuming fury that I had never witnessed before, an intensity so focused it felt like a physical force pushing against the air, a manifestation of unconditional intent. And he didn't even acknowledge Cassius at first, just stared at me on that table, confirming I was alive, before turning his gaze onto the monster who was holding me, and the voice he spoke with was low, deadly, and utterly devoid of emotion. A promise whispered in the dark, "Touch her, and I erase your bloodline, not just you." His threat calculated to wound Cassius at his most vulnerable point, his legacy, and Cassius, momentarily thrown off by the sheer suicidal intensity of Luciano's arrival, quickly regained his composure. Grabbing a wicked-looking blade from the surgical tray next to me, a long, thin scalpel that gleamed dully in the weak light, pressing the sharp edge directly against my heavily pregnant stomach, the cold steel sending a fresh wave of panic through me. And he sneered at Luciano, telling him to take one more step, and the child would die, making it a final agonizing choice between the heir and the man, forcing Luciano to choose between his personal future and his life. And for a heart-stopping moment, Luciano didn't move his hand, trembling slightly on the grip of his gun, the fate of his entire world hanging in that fraction of a second, the seconds stretching into an eternity, and then slowly, agonizingly. Luciano dropped the gun, letting it fall with a heavy thud onto the concrete floor, the sound ringing out like a final surrender, raising both hands in a gesture of absolute total surrender. The boss sacrificing everything, every vestige of his power and pride. His entire empire and his life and his voice was the quietest thing in the room. Utterly broken, a sound that tore through me more violently than any scream telling Cassius, "Take me! Let her go!" That second of hesitation, that single agonizing moment where Cassius paused, watching the great Luciano Blackwood surrender his life, his power, and his freedom for the woman he loved, a victory he had coveted for 10 years. That was the only break I needed, the only opportunity I would ever get, because while they were focused on the drama of the standoff, I wasn't just lying there helpless. I was fighting, twisting my wrists with a desperate adrenaline-fueled strength against the cheap leather restraints, focusing all my energy on the thin, exposed wire of the surgical lamp that was draped across the table, rubbing the leather back and forth, sawing through the material, with a frantic, silent determination, the rough leather chafing my skin until I could smell the faint metallic scent of blood mixing with the dust, forcing myself to ignore the burning sensation, concentrating only on the small frayed strand of leather. And as Luciano's words hung in the air, offering his life for mine, the last strand of the restraint snapped, freeing my right hand, and without even thinking, before Cassius could register the movement, before he could turn his attention back to me, I snatched the surgical knife, the one he had carelessly left on the tray right next to my head, a tool of his own planned demise, the cold handle surprisingly heavy and balanced in my palm, and with a swift, brutal force born of months of betrayal and the fierce primal need to protect the life inside me. I brought the blade up and drove it not elegantly, not dramatically, but with a cold, desperate efficiency, straight into the soft, exposed vulnerability of Cassius's throat, finding the exact spot where the jugular pulsed, and the shock on his face was absolute. The realization of his fatal mistake dawning just before the life left his eyes, the blood immediately spurting out in a violent arterial rush, coating the walls and the metal table as he clutched at his neck. Staggering backward, stumbling right into the tripod of a streaming camera he'd set up to record the entire abduction. His dying throes broadcast live to the digital underworld, a final fitting humiliation for the man who loved to play games, proving that the quiet woman always sees the moves others miss, and he fell a lifeless, sickening heap. The monster finally silenced, and the entire room went instantly terrifyingly quiet, leaving only the ragged sound of Luciano's breath, and the slow, steady drip of the rain outside as I slowly, carefully slid myself off the table. The sharp, cold steel of the knife still gripped tightly in my hand, my body shaking violently, but my eyes clear, the last remnants of the unassuming girl completely burned away, replaced by the quiet, resilient woman who had just saved her own life, and the life of her child, the true successor of my father's uncompromising strength. having completed the work of justice that had defined my life without even realizing it, proving that my agency had never truly belonged to either of them. Luciano was across the room in a second, his arms wrapping around me, holding me up as my knees finally gave out. And he didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because the way he held me, the absolute trembling relief in his grip, the desperate press of his face against my hair spoke volumes about the depth of the sacrifice he'd been willing to make. And I leaned into him, not as his wife, but as a survivor, clinging to another survivor. The tension of the last few months, finally snapping, leaving behind a raw, terrible intimacy that was more real than any love we had ever pretended to share, a connection forged in blood and sacrifice that wiped away every lie and every stolen kiss. And we stood there surrounded by the remnants of the storm and the silent, horrific consequences of Cassius's ambition, knowing that the empire, the money, the status, all of it, was suddenly secondary to the life we had just saved, the quiet, unexpected strength that had emerged from the most unlikely corner, and the world outside, the world of judgment and mockery and assumption, suddenly seemed very small, very distant, because they could never truly understand what had been won and lost in that moment, the true currency of our survival. We left the warehouse, the storm having passed, the silence heavy with mourning, and the simple act of walking out side by side felt like an entire lifetime lived in reverse, stripping away the roles of boss and wife predator and prey, leaving only two damaged people bound by a terrible truth, walking toward a shared future that was uncertain, but finally genuinely free from the old lies. The entire world thought they knew my story, thought they knew me based on who my husband was, or what neighborhood I came from, or how quiet I stood in the corner. But they always mistook my stillness for weakness, my dignity for obedience, and my silence for ignorance, never realizing that the things they dismissed as simple were the very foundation of my strength, the resilience that allowed me to take on the entire world and win. I learned that you don't have to shout to be heard, and you don't have to fight for respect when you carry the truth of who you are inside you. You were never small. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.